Can you hear me? Because I can't hear anything. Yeah, okay, because I can't hear you. All right. No, I still can't hear you.
All right. I can definitely hear you. Audio, false.
Yeah, I'm here. Okay, I can hear you now.
You can hear me now. Okay. The only thing is I've had to take my headphones out. So just, I don't know, I'll see how we go in terms of feedback. Okay, so hi everyone. Let's get started on this call-out final that raising kids gender neutral is unrealistic and potentially damaging to the kids. I imagine Josh will probably just make some opening statements, but I guess that one thing I was thinking maybe is that we could first of all talk about, because there are obviously two things to prove. The first is a realism dispute, and the second one is a damaging dispute. And maybe we could just go through them one at a time. So here are the things I've got just on the first one on it being realistic. The first thing I'd say is that I think it's very unclear to lots of people what raising a kid gender neutral even means. So here are a few things I've kind of brainstormed up, which I think people could try. They might, for example, try using clothing which is, gender neutral. So maybe certain color palettes are out of bounds, and some are in. The second thing is perhaps they would address the child by gender neutral pronouns. Perhaps they wouldn't ever call the child a boy or a girl. They might call them something else. And the problem I have here in terms of this being realistic or not is that they are going to be the odd one out. Like there are lots and lots and lots of people who are going to be raising their children conventionally, and even in school, specifically the way in which language is formed around gender will confuse that child a lot. So, for example, if the child is addressed by gender neutral pronouns, I don't think that the child is likely to think this is just something my parents are doing because I'm gender neutral and everyone else isn't. I think they're likely to think this is the normal way in which I address people. And when they address, say, for example, their friends by those pronouns, it's not going to make sense. If they write it into their schooling, if, for example, they're likely to be corrected in terms of their, teachers' English and stuff, it's not going to make sense. So I think, and likewise, as to what's a boy and what's a girl, if in social scenarios, it's like, right, boys go over here, girls go over here. If they're not told to identify with either of those things, I just think that given the contextual restraints, lots of the things which would make gender neutral parenting actually gender neutral will be unrealistic given the the broader social environment which the child is going to also have to interact with. So I'd like to hear from you what you think gender neutral parenting is and why it doesn't have these difficulties.
I think you've mischaracterized it in the way that we're not so much raising kids to be gender neutral. We're kind of raising them without the limitations of what the gender is. And so I get that the wording is really ambiguous here. But from what I understood to be gender neutral parenting is where you might not necessarily say that, a boy can't do this because it's a girl thing or vice versa. And so I think, with that said, I think that makes it a lot more realistic in the sense that, we're able to, raise people without, everyone saying that, boys are meant to be this and boys are meant to be tough and, they're meant to play sports and girls are supposed to be dainty and feminine and these kinds of things. And that's not to say that I think like that, but this is kind of where society has this, divergence as to what boys and girls should be. And I think that to say that we should be raising kids as specifically gender neutral is slightly unrealistic, but I think the characterization that I just gave is slightly more real, especially once people, people start to realize that there are actual benefits, and those sorts of things, that it becomes more realistic because people won't be the odd one out, especially because gender neutrality in itself is also becoming more prevalent in society. And so while they might be the odd one out now, then it's not as bad as it used to be. And it obviously in the future, as we tend to be a bit more open, it's a bit more realistic because, there's obviously more people doing it. There's more people that that are okay with it, and it means that, you know, more people accept it. And so I think in terms of unrealistic, I think right now, this very minute, it might be a little bit unrealistic, but given the way that, you know, we are progressing and the way that, you know, we kind of are becoming more open-minded, I think it can be realistic in the future.
Okay. So the first thing I want to kind of nitpick on is this idea of, I think it's important that we agree what gender neutral parenting is, because one of the way you said it was just basically, well, I wouldn't tell my child not to do something just because of the gender they are. But do you really think that parents are limiting their children like that to a huge degree now? Because like surely gender neutral parenting has to be more than just being a supportive parent, right? Because I think a lot of parents don't raise their children gender neutral. They still call them, for example, if they have a son, they still call them son, or they call them a boy. They buy them, like, you know, the blue things and the trucks and everything like that. But that doesn't mean that they're precluding them from playing hockey, for example, right? Because just typically more girls play it. That doesn't mean that they're locking them out of certain opportunities. So my question is, say like if you had a girl, right, and all she was interested in was typically feminine toys, right? Like that she just wanted to only play with those toys, and the clothing she was interested in was all feminine, right? So you're going shopping and she points to feminine ones. Do you interfere with that at all, or do you just kind of let that play its course? And if you don't interfere, in what sense is that gender neutral parenting?
I think it's I wouldn't necessarily interfere if that's what the child wants to identify as. I think in terms of gender neutral parenting, like what we should be doing is allowing kids to kind of identify as what they want. And if that means that, you know, a girl wants to be feminine and wants to wear girls' things, then that's fine. But on the opposite hand, if a girl wants to wear boys' clothes and they want to play what we would see as men's sports, then that's also fine. And that's what I would say is gender neutral parenting, where, you know, you kind of don't ever say that, you know, you can't do this or you can do this because of this is who you are. Whereas on the flip, like it's really common for someone to say that they're going to have a child that's a boy, and then everyone buys them boys things. We think that, you know, well, I think that that shouldn't really be happening, that we should not so much give them super neutral things, but we should give them the opportunity to either do one or the other. And if it means that, you know, kids are going to identify as their biological gender, then that's fine. But it also means that if they don't want to do that, then that's still fine as well.
Okay. So look, the thing I'm having difficulty with is should you do any? So should you call them, for example, boy, or should you? Do you know what I mean? Because I think there are lots of things which the child never chooses to do. But for example, right, like when you've got a baby, right? It's not pointing at things and making decisions, right? It's a baby. Are you going to call the baby who has, you know, kibbles and bits a boy and buy it, you know, boyish things when it's a baby? Or are you going to just leave it ambiguous? Like at some point, because I think the way you're explaining it right now is it's as if all children make all the choices for themselves, and we ought just not tell them not to do certain things. Like I think, for example, choosing what sport you want to be a part of, that happens way down the line by the time that most of their early rearing has already occurred. They've already been in kindergarten year one, and now they're playing a team sport because, you know, we're confident that they're not going to hurt themselves. Like in the times when they are not making choices, are you making those choices for them in a gendered assumed way, or are you doing completely neutral choices?
I would say to some extent neither. So we wouldn't exactly make them super ambiguous, but we wouldn't also, you know, give them one or the other. I think maybe give them both. So like rather than just buying like palettes of like blue and green and things for boys, you might buy, you know, some blue and green things, you might buy some pink purple things. You give them kind of all of the options, and, you know, you let them pick and choose what they want. And I get that they might not, you know, consciously choose, but then you also open the door for them to not be set by, you know, the parents saying that, you know, this is what I think is a boy, and then this is what my boy is going to grow up as, if that makes a bit more sense.
What about pronouns? Like, what pronouns are you using for them? Are you going to give them, for example, a name which is more masculine or feminine, or are you just going to stick to the androgynous names?
I would probably stick to more androgynous names. Just because, like, obviously, if you have like masculine names and then all of a sudden they want to identify as like a female, then that's going to cause problems. So I would definitely use more androgynous names for kids.
Okay, and are you going to address them by gender neutral pronouns, or are you going to start gendering them straight away?
I wouldn't use gender pronouns until such a point where my child decides that they want to identify as one or the other, or either or. And until they express or start to explicitly say that I feel like I should be a boy, then of course at that point in time I would use masculine pronouns. But on the flip side, and if they were never to say that, then I would be more than happy to use neutral pronouns.
And if for example, like, so this is why I think it gets into the unrealistic territory, because I think the way you're explaining it only works at a point where kids are making decisions, like in a way in which kids just don't make decisions, like at the point where they're already in like kind of mid-primary school and they're trying to pointing at which things they want to do. And I think, for example, in 99% of cases, they are going to conform in a relatively gendered way anyway. I think that if you're specifically targeting like quite young children and you're always giving them androgynous names, you're never calling them he or she until the child says, I want to be called this pronoun. I just don't think that's a question the kids are going to ask at any point. But I think what is going to happen, which is why I think this is unrealistic, is that the way in which you're creating norms around social discourse, like what pronouns you address other people by, the child is going to be confused why, for example, why the parents are calling themselves by gendered pronouns, but they get a different one. And I think maybe, like, as simplistic as a child would be, they might think, well, these are the adult pronouns and these are the kids' pronouns, so that when they start talking to other children, that's going to make it more difficult for them to interact with those other children. Do you see what I mean? How like the kind of delayed identity choice is not the way in which the child will internalize that decision. They're likely to just pretty much get confused.
Yeah, I kind of get that, but I also kind of think that we underestimate the fact that kids actually kind of tend to know these things pretty early. So like it's not like a kid is going to get to year 4 not knowing whether or not they're a boy or a girl. Like I feel like when it gets to that point, like when they get to school and they start talking to people and they start like actually experiencing things outside of their home, they're going to develop a pretty good idea of who they are pretty quickly. And so I think it is. And so I don't really think that, kids are going to get super confused. I think maybe a little bit, but obviously the more that they develop, the less confused they get because they learn more about it. I just think that, yeah, go on.
Because what I was wondering, for example, is that I think that it doesn't just start in the classroom, right? They're going to start reading books, right? And when they read the kids' book, like say you're reading Ring Around the Rosie or something, and all of the pronouns addressed to the female illustrations are she, and all the ones addressed to the male illustrations are he. Like they're going to be, that's different to me. And I think one of the things which I'm also curious about them is if you think that children are relatively switched on and they do find a relatively stable sense of self by the time they're as young as in year 4, then why do you need gender neutral parenting? Like, what is this gendered parenting doing, which is stopping them from finding that sense of self?
I think the biggest problem with gendered parenting is that, in a way it sets some form of precedent for stereotypes later on. And that's not to say that every parent is bad and every parent is like, yeah, we're going to teach our kids this, and then they teach them stereotypes. But I think that, we shouldn't be limiting kids to what we think as parents are boys or girls. And so obviously this is a bit hard for me because like I don't have kids, right? But I think that it's gendered parenting can be actually quite harmful, and that's not to say that it's bad. I just think that neutral parenting in some instances has more benefits to kids than gendered parenting, and this comes to things like the stereotypes. Like it's really harmful for a kid to get to say adolescence, and all of a sudden they start to realize that they are actually not their biological gender, or they identify as something different, but yet they've been told their whole life that they have to be whatever it is that they've been raised to be, and then all of a sudden that causes all sorts of problems. And so if we kind of give them the idea earlier on that, you know, you don't have to be exactly what you were born as, then it kind of mitigates a lot of the problems that they face later on in life.
Well, so I guess the question there is, so if it's your contention now that the way in which a parent raises a child places expectations on that child's gender, don't you think you could encounter the same issues if you place gender neutral expectations on that child, and then they grow up thinking, well, actually, I just wanted to be a boy, but I've been given this androgynous name. I've never been given any boyish clothes, and I've been addressed by gender neutral pronouns for the first 7 years of my life. Don't you think that that could carry like similar issues?
I think it could come with similar issues, but I don't think they'll be as bad as gendered parenting. Obviously, you know, no parenting style is perfect, but I think that neutral parenting is slightly better in the sense that, you know, we actually allow that room for choice rather than just saying explicitly, you know, you are born a male, you are going to be this, you know, we're going to teach you this. And even if it's implicit, like kids are raised to be whatever gender they were born as. And, you know, as good as that is for like X amount of the population, for the people who don't identify as whatever they were born as, I think really harmful. And I don't think it's going to cause as bad problems because they're going to grow up and think that, well, you know, knowing that that name is androgynous because let's just say, I don't know, Jamie, for example, like they're going to grow up seeing boys that are called Jamie. They're going to grow up seeing girls that are called Jamie. So it's not like they're going to think, oh, well, you know, this name is androgynous, like I'm so different, because they can see both. And I think in the clothing instances, like I'm pretty sure kids are going to be able to choose what kind of clothes they are, not at a young age, as like babies and such, but like when kids are able to consciously say, I want this and I want that, they're obviously going to point to whichever clothes they feel more comfortable as. And if that just so happens to be a boy who points to what we would see as feminine clothes, so like reds and purples and, you know, pinks and such, then that's fine. I don't think that's going to cause as many problems as, you know, a young kid who has this internal idea that, you know, that he's slightly different, who has to wear everything that he doesn't agree with. And so I think that, you know, there are harms on both sides, but I think gendered parenting just has slightly more harms or slightly more worse harms.
Okay. So here's something which I think is interesting. I think the goalposts as to what you're trying to achieve are shifting slightly in a very subtle way. On one hand, one thing you're trying to prove is that we shouldn't have stereotypes around gender. And the other one is that we shouldn't be trying to place pressures on a child's gender identity. Now, those are two very different things, because someone can be biologically male, identify as male, but also just be into, for example, the Veronicas, right? Or be and that would be an example of like a stereotype issue. But I think what most people think of when they think of gender neutral parenting is the idea that the child might not know actually what gender they are at all. That they might, for example, be biologically male, but identify as a woman. So those are two very different things. And I think at a lot of times when you're talking about trying to lowering the bar as to what we're actually trying to achieve here, you're talking about stereotypes. So I guess the question would be, for example, then, if we're going to shield the child from stereotypes, say like really good books, right? Like Harry Potter, for example. Would you stop a child from reading those types of books because the characters in those books conform generally to the stereotypes associated with different genders?
Well, not really, because like I think things like that are actually important, and like we can use that as a way to show, you know, obviously that people can go one way, but I think we should also have, you know, be letting them read or getting them to read books that have the opposite so they can see both. And so I think that's part of the problem, that we only show them one. And in terms of like the stereotypes thing, like I think the biggest problem with stereotypes is that parents, you know, they tell their kids that they can't do this or they can't do that. Like you brought up with the boy who identifies biologically and mentally as a male, but is into something like the Veronicas. And then all of a sudden his parents are like, well, no, that's like, you shouldn't like that. Or like, they just say some pretty nasty things, right? And so that kind of sets the precedent for the stereotypes that I'm trying to break down, which I think is really important, and I think is what parents should be doing, is that they should be just like letting their kids be into what their kids want to be into. And if that means not telling them that this is for boys, or not saying anything when a boy wants to do girl things, or vice versa, then I think that's fine. But in terms of the books, like I said, I think, it's important to have both. Obviously, some kids, they
Can you give us
might
an
want to
example of like
identify.
a really good book which is breaking like tons of gender norms? Because I find a lot of them to be quite like they're not very that well known because they're really not that pop. Like what would be a good gender norm breaking book which you would also encourage the child to read?
Well, I've actually never heard of one, and that's not to say that they don't exist, but I've actually never looked into it. I also don't read a lot, so I mean, I'm looking for one now, but like, I definitely think that there are ones that do that. Like, so for example, I've got a list here of 10 books that break gender stereotypes, and when it finally decides to load, I'll bring them up. But it's just things like, yeah, I just think things that, as a parent, we should be looking into things like this, and not just, buying the norms that society's been telling us is what is and what isn't for so long. Like, obviously, it's up to a parent to be looking into things like this, and I think that that's what parents actually need to do. Yeah, okay, just looking at these books, I've actually not heard of any of them, but that's except for Amazing Grace. But still, like, that's not to say that they don't exist. It's just because, we still have this weird view on neutrality and neutral parenting, that it's not as popular. But obviously, as we develop into it and it kind of becomes more prevalent, like, we will move into that territory, and it means that, things like this will become more popular and it will be easier.
But do you think perhaps that there's one of the reasons these books aren't as popular is just that they're not as good? So, for example, like there are lots of really great books which enforce gender stereotypes, right? Like books like Harry Potter and stuff. And the reason which lots and lots and lots of people like them and listen to them isn't because the kids, because let's be real, a lot of the readership was driven by kids. It's not like kids, at their pre-teen age and their teenage years were kind of like, well, I'm going to make my buying decisions based on what will enforce gender stereotypes. They're probably just really captivated by this story. Like it was one which caused more imagination. It used language, which, I as a kid, I read a lot. It allows you to expand your vocabulary. It gets you better marks in the English class, and it allows you to kind of, be more creative and more expressive. That those books are going to get kind of pushed aside in favor of ones which, are not as well written and don't capture the imagination, and might even harm the kids' interest in reading just for the sake of the fact that they're gender neutral.
I think that's assuming that we only have one or the other. And so, I mean, for me, if I were to do this, and like I just found another book that I've actually heard about quite a lot. It's two books actually. It's called Jacob's New Dress and Not All Princesses Wear Pink. Like both my brother and sister read both of those books, and I think, like I would definitely have, like a bookshelf that has both books that challenge stereotypes and books that don't. And so, and if that means that, like I would read this book to them at a younger age, and then that's fine. And if it means that they choose not to read that, then that's also fine, because that's not the only way to kind of break down these stereotypes, especially because I think the most important way to break down stereotypes is the way that, parents teach their kids. I just think that this is one mechanism to obviously mitigate these, but I just feel like there's a better way.
I think this is a priorities question though, right? Because what I think that the issue is that you're assuming that what I'm standing for is like harshly gendered parenting. Do you know what I mean? Like that the choices should be made to try and reinforce gender. But that's not really it. All I'm saying is that when we, for example, choose what types of books to read, we should choose the ones which are going to be best for the child's education and best for, capturing the child's imagination, even if those books reinforce gender stereotypes. And I would suggest that maybe what you need to stand for is sacrificing that in favor of gender neutrality. And so, for example, if there are good books, like genuinely excellent books which break gender norms, I wouldn't say that, for example, we should not teach them. I'd just be like, we're going to give the kid the book, not because it breaks gender norms, just because it's an excellent book. Likewise for, stuff like pronouns and names, I would say we should give kids pronouns and names which we think, are going to help the child function socially in the best way possible, which is going to make the child allowed to have the best friendships and things, regardless of whether it reinforces gender stereotypes. And likewise with clothes, I'd be like, we're going to buy clothes which are comfortable for them. We're going to buy clothes which, they're not going to on and stuff like that, even if they enforce gender stereotypes. So I guess the question is, we need to tackle here. Do you think that these sorts of things should be sacrificed so that the child can be gender neutrally parented, or do you think the priorities should be like kids' education and social integration, stuff like that?
I think the assumption that you just made is that, I think the assumption that you just made is that parents don't actually, all parents do things like that, which they don't. Like, it is really common to walk into even like a primary school and just see names that you think are just absolutely crazy. And then all of a sudden they're not popular. Those people aren't popular because everyone makes fun of their names. Or parents, dress their kids in a way that, isn't conducive to socialization and things like that. Like, that's assuming that parents actually, don't do those things. But I think that we somewhat should be making a sacrifice to both. I think that things like education and things like that are important. But I also think that identity is also really important, especially because when you look at like later in life, it's really hard for kids to actually focus on their education if they're, if they don't identify, if they feel like they're different and then they just feel disenfranchised from everything that they've ever known or everything that they know now. Like, it's really hard for them to focus on their education. And so I think it's, both of them are priorities. Maybe, neutral parenting is slightly more of a priority because it means that, when they, it has so many benefits for them, especially later in life, maybe not as young kids, but definitely when they get into like young adulthood and like adults and whatnot, it's much better for them to have realized that they are who they are early and not have to go through all of the harms that come from, feeling like they're different, feeling like they can't do anything about it because everybody's against them. And then all of a sudden they just, feel like they're such a shit person because they're so different. And so I think in terms of priorities, they're both equally prioritized.
Okay. Because we've got about 18 minutes left, I think we should move on to the idea of potentially harmful. We've kind of dipped our toe in the water a little bit. So the main thing I think is the issue for your case is that what you're saying is that if you raise your child in a particular way and then later in life they identify differently, that earlier influence will make it harder for them to make that transition. What I'm going to say here is that the premise of what you're talking about will also pressure the child to identify in a particular way, and that will be one where it's less gendered. And so, for example, there are going to be lots of children out there who who don't feel at all pressured to be gender neutral, right? Like when they express this, I think this is going to be through stuff like pronouns, through stuff like what books they're encouraged to read by their parents. Kids and it also is worth noting that just statistically, like in the crushingly vast percentage of times, people identify with the gender which they are given. Identify not that they are given, that they are, biologically born with. So biologically male in like 99% of cases is going to result in a gender in a male identifying person. That if you start taking that vast majority of cases and encouraging them away from the identity that we already know they usually identify with, that more of them are going to be stuck in the very conundrum you don't want. That they will feel confused later in life. They just won't understand what gender is. Does that kind of make sense? So what do you have to say to that issue?
I kind of disagree a little bit. Like, we're not so much raising them not to be genderless. Like, we will be teaching them about genders and things like that. We just allow more room for them to identify as whatever they feel more comfortable as, whether or not that's, identifying as their biological gender, identifying as the opposite gender, or identifying as neither, or even, both, and they're fluid, then that's fine. We are happy to stand by that. And at that point in time, I think we should be educating them in the same way, but we should also be, not limiting them to what I think we should, what I think parents do now, which is like implicitly teaching them stereotypes. And this just comes, and things like that. And this just comes in really simple ways, right? So like, when a little boy falls over, the most people's usual response is, oh, well, you'll be right, you're tough, get up, walk it off, dust it off, which is actually quite harmful, because you don't actually say the same thing to girls. Like, as soon as a girl falls over, maybe like scratches and grazes her knee or something, a lot of people like run over, they tend to mother her a little bit. And so they don't treat men and women the same. And then kids actually start to pick up on that. Like, I feel like kids are a little bit smarter than we give them credit for, and they might not think, very, very deep into it. But like, we're setting them early that, men and women are treated differently. And so at least the idea is that, raising them in the way that I'm propping here is that we kind of would treat them all the same. And if that means we would say to boys and girls that, you're right, you're tough, get up, or vice versa, then that's fine, because we're not instilling.
Which one would you choose?
Well, I don't think that's really that important, as long as, you treat them the same, as opposed to a child watching.
But that is important, because what if some people want to be mothered and some people want to save face? They just want to be the tough person. Because if you homogenize it so that you always treat that the same, you're going to lock out all of the people who want to be treated the other way.
I really don't think that's. I don't agree with that. I think that, if a kid, if we were to mother a kid, right, who's just fallen over and they want to be tough, then they're probably just going to get up and say, I'm fine, don't worry about me, and they're going to walk away. Like, I don't think kids are going to worry too much about that.
If that's true, why do we need to be gender neutral? Because if it's true that the kid's just going to identify with whatever it is they want, then why do we need to make sure that we're not, influencing them?
Because kids still see the difference. Like, they still see that, and it's not so much treating individual kids different. They will still see that, for example, like, and I wouldn't do this myself, but they might see me run over to a little girl who's just fallen over and treat her, so fine, be like, oh, okay, are you fine? Do you need anything? Let me help you up. But they're also going to see me treat men differently, which is the problem, because that's what sets the tone for them thinking that, people are actually different.
No. But if it is, as you said, that those kids, if they want to be treated the way they want to be treated, instantly just be like, nah, I'm fine, and they walk off, then won't the kids also see that? Because I think that the problem is you're trying to have your cake and eat it too. You're saying that, well, look, my version's fine because the kid, if they really want to be treated, will just protest and be treated the way they want to be treated. But when I ask you what's the problem with the way things are now, you say, well, look, the kids see that they're being treated differently and there's a problem. But if what you said first was correct, then what will happen is that everyone will rush over to the girl, and a certain percentage of those girls who don't want to be mothered will get up, be like, no, I'm fine. And the kids will also see that. So I'm confused as to where these stereotypes are coming from, because it seems like when you're against just the way things are, what the parents do define and the teachers do defines everything. But when I'm asking you why won't kids get the wrong message, you're like, no, it's the kids who know, and they'll just tell. Does that kind of make sense? I know it's getting a bit hard to articulate.
Yeah, I'm kind of there. I'm kind of not there. Like, I'll just, I mean, I don't really know what to say to that, because like, I think that, the difference is that on your side, we have people who are, they're not going to walk over to a boy at all. And on the flip side,
of course they will. Like, people still basically boys. It's just if the boy says, I'm fine, they don't insist on saying, no, tell us about your feelings, like, are you sure? We just take them at their word. So like, that's,
maybe that was a slight mischaracterization. What I should have said was that it's more likely, it's the way that they treat them differently. So like, a lot of people, and particularly like older men, will just say to a little boy, you're tough, that's fine. Whereas older women are kind of the opposite. And so people see that, and they see that the way that they treat kids. And so I think that like,
can I stop you right there? So when I asked you earlier, if you just use the same version, won't you lock kids out? You said, well, the kids will protest, right? So if the boy says, what are your feelings are like? And the boy will say, no, I'm tough, we just leave him be. My question is, when we say the boy in the current status quo, you're tough, get over it, and they still bubble on, right? And they're still really, really hurt. Won't that also send the same norm-breaking message to everyone else watching that actually that method doesn't work for everyone?
Well, no, because not all boys are going to be like that. So you're obviously going to have some boys who are like, oh, this really hurts, like, and they just, like, I don't know what kids are like when they hurt themselves. I don't really, spend a lot of time around kids. But obviously you're going to have some boys who are like, they're going to cry. They're going to be really emotional about it. And so if we keep telling them, like, in the status quo when men are kind of like, oh, well, boys are tough. Like, if we keep telling them that, that's actually kind of harmful to them. And so I think it's good for, little boys who are like, yeah, okay, I'm fine. Like, I'm just going to walk away. But if we treat all boys like that, and then without at least offering them to treat them the other way, then it's really harmful for those boys that are kind of like outside of that, those parameters that are like, yeah. So they're really emotional. Like, I don't know, anecdotal here. For me as a kid, like, every time I used to hurt myself, everyone was like, oh, well, you'll be right, get up. Whereas I was like a really emotional kid. And so like, it literally made me feel like I was, not the same as all of the other boys. And I would imagine it's slightly different and slightly the same for girls, just on the other side. And
well,
so at least
don't you think you'd still feel different? Don't you think you would still feel different if all the other boys were choosing differently? Because what you're saying is that with your version of parenting, the parents should just cater to whatever the kid wants. The majority of boys will still be different. So won't you still get that feeling of difference?
I think you will get a slight feeling of difference. I just, again, think it won't be as bad. Like when I think looking at the way that everybody else is slightly different to having like older people who you kind of look up to and are generally influenced pretty heavily by, who are saying that you have to be this or you should be this rather.
Okay.
And so I think
very heavily
obviously both sides are flawed.
Yeah, but if they're very
obviously
influenced, then why won't they be influenced to be gender neutral, which has all the other harms? Do you see what I mean? Like when I'm like, won't the kids be, dysphoric because you're now removing gendered expectations from them? They'll feel the pressure to be gender neutral. You're like, no, they're not influenced. They'll choose for themselves and that'll be fine. When I'm like, why can't they choose themselves? You're like, because they're very heavily influenced. That's the problem. Like you can't have it both ways.
Well, the reason that they're influenced now is because of the way that we raise them. Like we raise them with sort of, precedents for things. Whereas if we take away those precedents, yeah, they might be influenced. But like if a kid's own parents are acting in a way that's like somewhat neutral, then obviously the kids are going to sort of take on that influence rather than just having parents acting like, a boy should be a boy and not giving them at least, a slight option to identify as something else. Then obviously the kids are more likely to end up as at least thinking that they identify as a boy. And when it comes to later in life, they are actually going to be quite harmful. And so, yeah, I'm going to admit, I don't think either side is perfect. I think I just think gender neutral parenting is slightly more beneficial to the kids than gendered parenting that we have now.
Well, I just think that given that the majority of the population correlates with their gender, that my side is going to be better for more people and your side is going to be better for the minority, but worse off for everyone else, hence potentially damaging to children. I guess the last thing which I have said, is because I haven't got much time, is that it is just physiologically and psychologically solved that there are differences, not for everyone, but on net for men and women, right? That boys and girls, because our brains are marinated in different hormones, that, we do have different body parts. And we do have, if you look at like, for example, psychometrics, we are standard deviations out on total, that not everyone embodies those changes, but the majority of us tend to and trend to. So given that is the case, I think a lot of the stereotypes and a lot of the different practices which have come about are a result of actual just science telling us that is what is best for children. And we've seen that, unfortunately, schools which teach boys and girls different have been locked out by the PC police and told that, no, you must treat these people the same, even when it is worse for those people's education. We've seen that, for example, if you make maths tests more, literally, like you make the questions more problem-solving wise, girls do better. If you make them more hard, just, question, answer, boys do better. And these are studied and proven phenomenon. And what I would suggest is that, yes, there will be some people who fall out of those trends. They are the minority. What we ought to be doing is setting a standard which helps the most people most of the time. And that, moving to this gender neutrality thing is going, I think, to make the assumption that everyone's actually more similar than we think, and that's going to end up hurting a lot of kids' education and hurting a lot of kids' social development in the future. I guess what do you say? What do you say to that?
I really don't think that that's entirely true. I think that obviously like we do have differences. Like men are somewhat more suited to things like harder labor, and that's not to say that women can't do that. I think just physiologically men are better suited to it. But that also doesn't mean that we should be locking out people from doing that just because we think that men are different and men and women are different. I think that the whole premise of this is that we kind of take away limitations. And so like if a girl wants to work hard to be something like a brickie or a plumber, then that's totally fine. As opposed to saying that making them think that that's a men's job, and making men think that things like primary school teachers and childcare workers are generally women's jobs. And we can see that there is a massive difference between things like in job industries where they're so heavily skewed to either men or women, and kids see that. Kids actually see when they go to something like a doctor's surgery and they see a whole lot of male doctors, then they're going to think that that's a men's job. And so that's what I think.
So you're saying that we shouldn't take kids to the doctors in case they get the impression that it's a men's only profession? Like, this is what I'm saying about it being unrealistic. How are you going to break that stereotype, given that that's just a fact of the world?
I think we should be educating them, because what happens is when we set stereotypes early on, right, and kids start to think that men and women are different, then they're less likely to go into job industries which they think are more heavily dominated by men, right? So back on the doctor thing, or actually let's move away from the doctors. Let's move to things like primary school teachers, right? Most primary school teachers are females. That's just a fact, right? You can't. That's just it.
But
and the reason,
like the kids are going.
Yeah, they're going to go to.
Yeah.
Yeah. So kids are going to go to school. They're going to see that it's mostly females, and so without any other influence saying that men and women are not different, if they start to think they're actually different, then it means that men are less likely to do women jobs and vice versa, which means that we're going to constantly have this cycle of men in men jobs and women in women jobs.
But this is very different to what you said at the start. What you said at the start is we're just going to let them float through the world, and if they express a different preference, we're going to support it. Now what you're saying is that we get that the kids are going to see stereotypes in the world, so we need to essentially enforce some sort of propaganda upon them, telling them that actually, no, that's not true. You should consider other things. So at the start, I was a bit confused as to what this gender-neutral parenting thing is, because it just sounded like the status quo. Now it sounds like you were taking active steps to try and tell the child that those preferences people are choosing are not of their own doing, that those primary school teachers are only doing that because they're forced to. Do you know what I mean? How those two are very different things?
Yeah, I get that they're different, but I don't think that it's like I don't think that we're telling kids that their choices are based on anything other than the fact that that's what they want to do. And I think the problem is that what we kind of tend to do is that we kind of act as if kids can, or boys and girls can only act in a certain way. And so what my idea of gender neutral parenting is kind of like, we just don't limit them to anything. And so if, we don't really say, we kind of teach them that things like primary school teachers and things like doctors, right, that they can be done by both.
But Josh,
and
by your own admission, the world is limiting them to those things. If it's what, do you know what I mean? So you have to do more than just say, well, I'm not going to stop them. Because I don't think I'm obliged to do that either. Like, I'm not obliged to say that all boys must be told to be brickies. I'm just saying that we should perhaps let boys be boys when they want to do those things. Like, what you